It's looking like we have some people starting to roll in. We could probably give it a couple more minutes.
So we are recording tonight's presentation and we'll make it available for anyone who signed up and hasn't joined or isn't able to join us tonight. As Sarah mentioned, we're noting that a lot of people are just signing on. So why don't we go ahead and start with introducing ourselves and giving you a sense of what we'll be doing on tonight's meeting, and that might give folks a little bit more time to join. So good evening and thanks for signing on tonight to join to talk with us about the neighborhood code. My name is Megan Tuttle. I'm the planning director here for the city of Burlington. And Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Sarah Morgan. I'm a planner in the Office of City Planning with Megan, working with her on this project.
So the work that we're doing here in the Burlington Neighborhood Code is something that our office has been working on for a little over a year. Some of you may have attended other events or heard about this work through meetings at the farmers market or coffee hours or other things that we have been doing over the last year. But tonight, the purpose is for us to give you kind of an overview, especially for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to join us, to give an overview of what the neighborhood code is and why we're doing it, and then to share with you some of the recommendations that are currently under discussion by a joint committee of the City Council's Ordinance Committee and our Planning Commission. We're using this as an opportunity to kind of give you all an interim kind of update on the work that that committee is doing and to collect some feedback on these proposals so that the committee can use them in their continued work over this fall. So our plan for tonight is to give a presentation. It'll be a little bit on the longer side because we've got a lot to cover, but about 30 minutes at most. And then we'll use the rest of the time that we have to answer questions or to just hear input that you have for those of you that are joining us tonight. So Sarah, with that, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Awesome. Great, thanks, Megan. So, as Megan said, we're here talking about the neighborhood code, and another idea that is really popular across the US right now in a lot of American cities is the idea of missing middle housing, and what we're referring to as this neighborhood scale housing, which refers to certain housing types such as duplexes, fourplexes in this middle area on the spectrum that are not currently able to be built in Burlington's residential areas due to zoning regulations. Here's some examples, some close-up examples of what these middle housing types also look like. And the neighborhood code is about how these types can fit in alongside existing buildings within our existing residential areas. So one of the purposes for the neighborhood code is that this is about how not just how these housing types can fit in along other buildings, but how we can incrementally evolve our existing neighborhoods to meet the changing needs of households and our communities. And our team has been involved in a number of changes to zoning laws, especially related to housing and the 2021 Housing Action Plan. Changes proposed for the neighborhood code help us implement this in a way that looks at our limited land area in the future. So most of the zoning changes recently have focused in this area in gold on the left of the screen, which have been planned for the most intensive future growth in the city. However, not all of these areas can or will accommodate housing. These are areas that we're planning for jobs or economic growth, and they also include public school sites and areas like most of the South End that might not be intended for residential development. An area that we have also paid a lot of attention to recently is the downtown area circled right here. But this only represents a fraction, 4% of the city's total land area. And even as there are ways that we can and have continued to grow in this area, it's been mainly focused on larger scale multifamily housing needs. Megan, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you okay, Sarah, but I wonder if your headphones might be affecting your sound quality.
Sure, yeah. Let's see. Do you want to jump in real quick while I kind of adjust?
Sure can. So while Sarah's doing that, she was just starting to say that we are talking about through the neighborhood code, the areas on the map on the right, which are our residential areas in the city. Sarah, if you want to skip ahead just 2
All right,
slides,
how's that, Megan?
I think you might sound a little bit better, but for those
Oh,
of you who are
great. Sorry, I
on,
just
just
lost
let
my
us
audio.
know.
Sorry.
Okay, great. Sorry, we're gonna just pause for 1 second while Sarah gets reconnected.
I've gotten confirmation that it sounds fine elsewhere, but my uh, headphones just went out for a second. All right,
You're
we'll try
able
and
to
speak
hear
a.
now?
Yes, I can hear now.
Okay,
Um,
great.
great. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much for letting us know that quickly, so that we could troubleshoot. Sarah, if you want to skip ahead just 2 slides, I think we kind of teed up the areas that we're talking about. So
Awesome. Great. So, as Megan might have just said, when we look at how we got here, it's important for us to remember that 80% of these residential areas are currently zoned for the lowest residential development possible. Another purpose of this is by increasing these housing opportunities through neighborhood scale solutions requires less land per home, which would then utilize existing infrastructure. By offering more housing types and choices, this allows for potential socioeconomic integration within existing neighborhoods, as well as these opportunities for multi-generational housing and aging in place, as well as expanding the tax base, sharing the tax burden across multiple households. So as we talked about in the beginning, this housing type offers new opportunities within these existing neighborhoods. And one thing that we know is that today, early adult, early career adults, young homeowners, and people of retirement age make up about a third of the city's population. These housing types will allow for more housing options across the individual's housing journey, as well as allow residents to adjust their housing needs based on where they are in this stage of life. And this is one of the reasons that AARP is so interested in housing solutions like middle housing and like the neighborhood code. Similarly to ADUs, these housing types offer yet another tool for older adults to be able to remain in their homes, age in place, and offer and have housing options accessible, utilizing universal design standards, and also potentially lower maintenance costs. We also know that types of homes available in particular neighborhoods can greatly influence who's able to live in what neighborhood. We know that the majority of the city's households, just over 60%, are renter households. And while we do have a large student population, this is not all student households. And in fact, the majority of most age groups in the city are renters. But when we look at the city's land area, 60% of the areas zoned for residential development are currently home to single family homes, most of which are owner occupied, about 80% being owner occupied. We know that whether or not someone is able to rent their home has a close relationship to race or income as well, which we see in this chart on the left. Related to these single family home costs that make up the large portion of these residential neighborhoods, recent trends show that the home sale price in Burlington show that purchasing a single family home is very much out of reach for the majority of Burlington residents. Similarly to rental housing, the average 2-bedroom unit in Chittenden County rents for just over $1,600 a month, but we know that we have examples of housing costs that are much higher. Research on middle housing types suggests that the housing units within middle housing types tend to be somewhere between the somewhat more affordable than other housing types, and particularly more affordable to single family homes. These housing types can sometimes be naturally affordable to people earning what is considered to be that middle income. And more of these housing types can be an important complement to the work and resources that are already being done to expand housing stock for a deeper and more permanently affordable housing solution across the city. The final purpose of the neighborhood code is that it will allow us to comply with Vermont's Home Act of 2023, which introduced new statewide zoning requirements for duplex, triplex, and 4-unit buildings. Per the Home Act, we must allow for duplexes to be treated the same as single-family homes, and 3 to 4-unit buildings must be allowed by right within where any residential uses are already allowed. And Megan, I don't know if you want to have any additional points that you want to call out on this.
Nope, you did a good job.
Great. Awesome.
Great. So to pick up on what Sarah just shared, I'm going to talk a little bit about, with that background, about what the neighborhood code is proposing. To start us off on that discussion, we thought it'd be helpful to give you a really brief update on what our zoning allows in residential areas today. You saw this map earlier that Sarah provided. This highlights all of the areas of the city that are currently within one of our residential zoning districts. We currently have 5 residential zoning districts. And these range all the way from our low density zoning districts, like what apply to many parts of the city, many different types of neighborhoods, like the New North End or South Cove, all the way to our high density residential neighborhoods, such as those neighborhoods that are immediately adjacent to downtown. This, you saw this slide earlier, Sarah provided sort of looking at 3 different areas of the city where we're planning for either growth, conservation, or the areas of the city in our residential districts. And we wanted to share this quickly, laying all of those together on top of one another to show how the neighborhoods are connected by these areas in gold that Sarah mentioned have been areas of focus for more intense residential or even mixed use development. In many cases, allowing for larger apartment buildings, taller buildings, more intensity of development. Those are the areas where we really are targeting that type of growth. And the neighborhood code is really about more of those neighborhood scale housing options that Sarah mentioned earlier. On the next slide, you can see some of those examples again of what Sarah shared earlier when we're talking about these middle housing types or neighborhood scale housing solutions, things like duplex, fourplex, types of buildings, many of which you can find in neighborhoods across Burlington today, as well as some housing types like townhouses or even small multi-unit buildings, as we've started to talk about with the committee, and I'll mention a little bit more in just a minute. But the challenge is that while we have seen many of these housing types in Burlington, on the next slide, you'll see that it can actually be very difficult, if not impossible, for new housing types like these to be created in Burlington's residential areas. So you might be wondering, if we already have some of these housing types, how that could be the case. We have been working over the last year to study the city's neighborhoods and our zoning rules and how those zoning rules have changed over time to better understand the answer to that question. And one thing that we found, which is very common across many cities, is that over the 70 years that we've had zoning rules in Burlington, these zoning rules have changed. And in many cases, those zoning rules have become a bit more restrictive than they were when many of the homes in these neighborhoods were originally built. This means that today, just under half, about 40% of the lots in our residential neighborhoods do not conform to the zoning laws we have in place today. And that can be very limiting for, setting aside whether anybody would like to create a new home on their property. It can be limiting even for the evolution of people's existing homes, as Sarah mentioned, as they move through the life cycle of their housing needs. We also know that in some cases, our zoning rules have seemed to allow certain types of homes, but in reality, they can be almost impossible to create in some places. For example, we have almost always allowed duplexes to be created in all of our residential districts in the city, but the specific rules that you have to meet in order to have a duplex mean that in some cases, entire neighborhoods are prohibited from being able to actually build a duplex. This is because of things like not making sure that our standards match the size of lots that are in neighborhoods across the city. And finally, we've been looking closely at some of our other standards that were meant to help regulate the sort of overall scale of buildings or overall scale of homes in these neighborhoods. This is an example of 4 almost identical duplexes in the Old North End. These are classic Old North End duplexes. Probably most of these homes used to be single family homes and at one point were converted to a duplex. All of them have parking on their property. But ultimately, under our zoning rules that we have in place today, only the 2 buildings on the left would be able to be built new as a duplex, and the 2 on the right would not. The reason for this is actually almost imperceptible from the average passerby, anyone who kind of lives in this neighborhood and understands how these homes fit within the fabric of the Old North End. And that really has to do with how our rules relate the number of homes you can build on a property to the size of the property. So ultimately, through the neighborhood code, a couple of the things that we're doing initially is exploring some of these challenges and making sure that we understand how our zoning rules work, how they relate to the historic neighborhood patterns that many of our neighborhoods have seen over time, and help us identify some of the common zoning barriers that we share with other communities as well, to enabling more of these small and middle housing types that Act 47 is asking us to enable. Beyond that, though, we've also been looking at other creative housing types. We've heard a lot about the need for a wider variety of housing options in the city, especially for a broader range of residents in Burlington. A cottage court is one example of that creative housing solution that we've been looking at. You can see here an example of an actual lot in the New North End, a very large lot in the New North End that currently has only one single family home on it. And this cottage court example looks at how a number of additional freestanding single family home type structures could share that lot, help reduce the cost, the individual cost of home ownership or access to a house like that in the city, but also provide ample space, ample open space, a shared garden area, and even off-street parking. We've heard a lot of excitement and interest in a housing type like this by many people in the city in our conversations, but unfortunately, for a whole variety of reasons, our zoning rules do not allow this to happen. Another example that we've been looking at are the places in the city where we have our lowest density zoning districts along major streets like North Avenue. These are major arteries that connect the New North End to the downtown and even over, into Colchester. These are the kinds of streets that are served by public transportation and may even have close proximity to things like grocery stores and other small neighborhood businesses that are within walking distance. Again, our zoning rules do not allow for much flexibility for how new homes could be created in these locations. So one of the other things that we're looking at through the neighborhood code are these corridors and what flexibility could be introduced in these places. So altogether, we're looking at those historic issues, as well as these issues of flexibility for how we move forward in the future. Over the course of the last year, we have been talking about this as, really trying to help make more of these homes more permissible across the city. And we've been doing that through forums like going to the farmers market, going to the coffee hour at the Bagel. We hosted some walking tours and other events to help just share information about what middle housing types are. and also to collect input from people about their preferences and thoughts about the different scale of these housing types, so that we can use that information to help inform the recommendations that this joint committee is looking at now. Through that work, we've heard a couple of common themes. We've heard a lot of different types of things, but just a couple common themes. One is that we've heard a general support for more housing and for the idea of allowing more housing choice and different housing types across neighborhoods. This has also, in a lot of ways, helped renew the interest that we heard from folks a few years ago when we helped make it more possible to build accessory dwelling units. So we've heard more people who are starting to really become interested in that as a long-term plan for their own housing needs and their own property. We've heard a variety of opinions, though, about how permissive this neighborhood code should ultimately be. We've heard a lot of interest and excitement in the idea of these neighborhood scale housing types, especially some of those on the smaller end, like the duplex, triplex, those types of units, as well as a lot of interest in townhouses as a more affordable homeownership opportunity that could be introduced in the city. We have heard from some other people, though, that they feel like these proposals don't go far enough and that we have a real housing crisis in the city. We have a real climate crisis. We have a real affordability crisis in terms of both the cost of housing and the cost of building new housing, and that these proposals don't go quite far enough in terms of the sort of scale or intensity of new homes in order to help address those problems. So ultimately, our discussions in the committee have been about kind of how we find balance in the scale and overall approach to the neighborhood code, given these ranges of opinions. We have heard a lot of input about the desire for the neighborhood code to help support more homeownership opportunities. To be clear, the neighborhood code will not mandate homeownership, but this is definitely a major consideration we've been giving in terms of how the recommendations that the committee is looking at now were developed. And ultimately, we've just heard a lot of questions about, so how will people actually build this, which is a separate set of issues that we'll be working on in the next phase of this work. So what is the committee looking at right now? Ultimately, the neighborhood code includes two sort of sets of proposals. The first set of proposals are actual changes that we're proposing to the core zoning rules that guide what type of homes can be created where. And then they're also looking at a map of where the different zoning districts that we talked about at the beginning apply in the city. The committee is looking at kind of all of the rules that regulate zoning, including some pretty nitty-gritty things that we won't bore you with tonight, but looking at things like allowing smaller lots in terms of, what kind of lot would allow for a new home or new homes to be created on. They're looking at things like setbacks and lot coverage limits that can be major factors in the sort of overall amount of a lot that can be built on to accommodate homes. Importantly, we're looking at replacing some of our former zoning tools like density limits, which, as I mentioned before, regulates how many homes can be built on a lot based on the size of the lot, with standards that more explicitly regulate the size of a building and regulate the number of units that can be in those buildings. We're also looking at specific solutions to help create or help allow new lots to be created to put homes on them. So this third column that you can see here shows a couple of examples of what we mean by that. Again, we've heard that homeownership is a major interest and priority for many people. We also know that Burlington is a largely built out city. So unlike our neighbors in Colchester or South Burlington or Williston, we don't have a lot of land area to grow, particularly with new single family homes. So one of the ways that we are hoping to help encourage more creation of those types of homes is by allowing lots to share their lot area. by subdividing and creating new smaller lots that homes could be built on, or even allowing for the land underneath each half of a duplex to be freestanding land that would allow for two people to own each half of a duplex. And then finally, I mentioned that we're looking at other creative housing types that have been really difficult to create in the city over time, like those cottage courts or like more townhomes in some locations where larger lots are available. On this slide, you can see some examples of what those changes to the rules might look like in different zoning districts within the city. The row of homes that are on the top or to the left of your screen are reflective of the proposals that the committee is talking about for areas of the city that are zoned for low density development. This could include things like a new home in a backyard or an addition or expansion to the back of an existing home to create a new unit. In some rare cases, this could include new buildings altogether. Ultimately, the proposals that the committee is looking at include a modest increase to lot coverage to 45% lot coverage for these neighborhoods. So just under half of, that means that just over half of the area of a lot has to be open space, lawn or landscaping of some kind. We're looking at maintaining the allowance that buildings could be up to 2.5 stories tall. This is the predominant building height across the city today. But we're introducing new limits on the overall size of a building and limiting the number of units that could be on a lot in a building to 4 units. In the lower, oops, sorry, can you go back? In the lower right-hand side of the screen, you can see similar diagrams that reflect neighborhoods that are typically zoned residential medium. So this is more like the Old North End today. Again, just kind of seeing how this could result in a new building on a lot or an expansion to an existing home. Again, in some cases, a new building altogether. For these areas, for the residential medium areas, the zoning would allow a slightly more permissive intensity of development. About 60% of the lot could be built on for homes. This would allow for up to 6 units in a building. This is something that the committee is actively discussing right now, just a slight increase over the low density areas. The other areas that we're looking at include the high density zones. We're actually not proposing many changes to the high density districts. Again, these are kind of small areas immediately adjacent to downtown. These are already pretty small lots and they already allow for fairly high intensity of development. The main thing that we're proposing to change here is just removing the density limits, but otherwise keeping a lot of the standards for these areas the same. And then the new district that we're talking about are these corridors. This is a district that we'll show you a map of here in a second, but apply to, again, those major streets in the city. And proposing to allow development kind of along a similar scale to what you see for the high density neighborhoods around downtown. Again, these are areas where we're trying to support a level of housing that could help support and be supported by things like access to transportation, public transportation. This has evolved a bit as the committee has discussed the proposed changes, and they're currently thinking about kind of allowing townhouses, you know, a row of like 3 to 5 townhouses or small multi-unit buildings that could have as many as 12 units in them. That's the kind of range that we're talking about. These are just a couple quick examples of what these changes might look like within the existing fabric of neighborhoods. So this is kind of a snapshot of the Old North End, for example, a neighborhood that's zoned for residential medium. And this next image shows what it could look like to see new buildings enabled by the neighborhood code kind of fitting within that existing fabric. Similarly, we have an area of the city that's zoned for low density development. So this is kind of reflective of Staniford Road or Woodbury Woodlawn, that kind of area of the new North End. And again, what it could look like to see more new homes fitting alongside those existing neighborhoods. So what does this all mean in terms of where you might be living in the city? This is a more detailed version of the map of the city's residential zoning districts that we mentioned earlier. The brightest yellow and the bright pink that you can see are the low density areas that we were talking about. This applies to much of the city, the New North End, the Hill section, neighborhoods like Five Sisters, Birchcliff, the Addition, South Cove, the Old East End, and the neighborhoods between Willard and Mansfield at the kind of eastern part of the Old North End. The dark, if it might look gold or green to you, colors in the middle of this legend really apply to the rest of the Old North End and some of the areas along South Winooski and St. Paul Street, just south of downtown before you get to Five Sisters. These are the areas of the city that are zoned medium density today. And then, as we mentioned before, the last district is this high density residential district in orange, which applies to the area between downtown and UVM's campus and just a couple blocks right around the edges of the downtown core. The proposed changes to the map are coming from a variety of, or are resulting from a variety of considerations. The first is that we're proposing to streamline this map. You just saw that we said we have 5 districts. Essentially, we only have 3. We have a couple of districts that are called waterfront low density or waterfront medium density districts that really are no different from the low density and medium density zones. So we're just proposing to streamline those districts. We do have some other tools to help address development near the waterfront, which is really what the purpose of those districts are, that we will be handling in a different way. So that, if you could go back just one time, Sarah. So these areas in the brightest yellow, all of the low density districts, if you can remember back to the diagrams I just shared with you, are those areas where we would be proposing allowing, the 45% of the lot to be covered by buildings, up to 4 units within those buildings, and ultimately maintaining a height of about 2.5 stories in those areas. The next set of changes, as you heard me say before, are really intended to help us address the challenge of how our zoning has evolved over time and kind of become out of alignment with what has historically been built in some parts of the city. So these changes that are called out here in the sort of green or gold color are areas that we're primarily proposing to change from the low density zoning today to medium density zoning in the future. So these are areas like that neighborhood between Willard and Mansfield, the streets between South Union and South Willard, kind of south of Maple Street, the Five Sisters neighborhood, and even those streets like Clymer and Hoover, just off of Shelburne Road. Again, these neighborhoods were built in many cases long before zoning or in the earliest days of our zoning, where we had bigger buildings and a mix of housing types that have become essentially illegal under the evolution of our zoning standards today. There's also a small area just to the south, roughly at the intersection of Pine Street and Maple Street, that's currently zoned for medium density that we're proposing to change to high density, again, because that's really more reflective of what's on the ground in that area. So again, this is focused mostly on the residential medium district, which I mentioned before, slightly higher level of intensity that would be permitted than the low density areas. And notably, the committee has recommended that instead of allowing up to 4 units in these places, then in all of the RM zones, we would allow up to 6 units. And then the last one, as I mentioned, is about kind of looking at areas where we can implement our planning goals and allow for greater flexibility for the intensity of housing types. So the primary thing that we're looking at here are those corridors that I've alluded to. These are areas that have been called out in our citywide plan as places that we want to make sure are supportive of and supported by mixed use and access to public transit, et cetera. So these include North Avenue, parts of Colchester Avenue, Shelburne Road going into St. Paul, into downtown, and Lower Pine Street, where it's actually zoned for residential development. As you may remember, these would be areas that would allow for those bigger, more intense buildings like townhouses or the small multi-unit buildings, and are areas that the committee has actively been discussing, not only in the sense of are all of those areas appropriate for those corridor zones to be the future zoning rules, or are there areas that are not in this that should be added to this as well. And then the last one is the Champlain Elementary property. Believe it or not, that school property is actually in our low density residential district. And if any of you were around and part of the South End plan discussion from about 10 years ago, that was one of the sites that had been identified as a great opportunity to utilize some of the open space behind the school for new housing opportunities. So in order to help facilitate that, we're actually proposing changing that school sites zoning from low density to medium density. And I think with that, this is just kind of a summary of how all of these changes would be reflected in the overall zoning map that we showed you at the beginning. Really just, and again, intending to allow more flexibility in those duplex, triplex, even 4-unit buildings citywide, and in some places allowing for more intensity, particularly in terms of the corridors and the core neighborhoods closest to downtown. So I think with that, Sarah, that's all we have, right? Yes. Okay. We promised we wouldn't talk all night long. So a lot to cover, but I hope that that gives you all a good sense of what the committee is recommending. So I see a couple questions here in the chat that I'll answer while the rest of you are considering whether you would like to ask questions or share input. You're welcome to do this either through using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or if you'd like, you can use the raise hand feature and Sarah will help enable your microphone so you can share a comment with us. So there's a question here, 5 Sisters would become medium density. Yes, that is the proposal. If you could go back to that slide, Sarah, go up just a couple more here. So yes, the 5 Sisters area is one of the areas that we would propose change from low density to medium density under the neighborhood code recommendations. There's a question here that says, what about the area off Lakeside next to the new Parkway and connector? I thought that area was going to have massive multi-unit buildings of 6 to 8 stories. So yes, we had shared at the very beginning of the presentation just some other parts of the city that allow housing development. That is in an area that we refer to as a mixed use zoning district. So it allows both homes and offices, stores, other types of development all on the same lot. So that is actually, if you go back to the map of the 5 Sisters, Sarah, roughly here where it says 5 Sisters, just a little bit below the label that says 5 Sisters is the area where that new district was proposed. So we're not talking about any of those areas that allow for mixed use development. We're just talking about the areas of the city that are primarily for residential development. All right, I'll go to a live question and then I'll come back to the Q&A. So Sarah, do you want to?
Yeah, it looks like we have Gabriel Arnold has their hand raised. Gabriel, you should be allowed to talk.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for this opportunity. I just want to provide some input here.
Okay.
So I live with my family of four on Pine Street, between Flynn and Home Ave. So, you know, as Pine Street goes from kind of a commercial street at Flynn and then turns residential, I'm down on that section. And
Okay.
I wanted to know, I'm very glad to see the urgency to address the housing crisis that we're facing, and commend you for all the time and effort you're putting in to address the challenge and the bold proposals you're putting forward. I think that's what it's going to take. And I know there's a lot we can do here. I like a lot of what I've seen today, but I think it's really important that the changes are contextually sensitive to the neighborhoods that they're proposed in. Just on kind of, if you look at the section of Pine that I live on between Flynn and Home, these comments probably apply to further south beyond Home as well. But we have 23, our street is made up of 23 single family homes and 3 small duplexes and quadplexes. All of them are 2 stories or less, and all but a couple that have been grandfathered are very low lot coverage, and we have no businesses or commercial uses. And so if you go by the definitions that you've put forward here for the different residential districts, we would currently meet the low density or the RL district. And so what I'm seeing is that you're proposing to change our neighborhood street from the lowest all the way up to the highest level of intensity as a corridor. And so this would, I know you've kind of characterized them as small multi-unit buildings, but and compared to our neighborhood, this would allow for large multi-unit buildings, of which we currently have none. It would allow for mixed-use buildings and businesses on our street, of which we currently have none. It would allow buildings up to 3.5 stories, which are far taller than anything that we've got right now. And it would allow for development really close to the street and this really high lot coverage that's completely out of character for our neighborhood. And I know that you've kind of put this forward as zoning changes that are to enable neighborhood scale, context sensitive housing solutions. But what's proposed here on Pine Street south of Flynn is vastly out of context and scale for what the street is currently. I'd also like to comment about the transportation corridor that Pine is in this neighborhood south of Flynn. This corridor, as I understand the definition that you put forward in the plan, a residential corridor, they are intended along the city's major multimodal transportation corridors. And that's not Pine Street south of Flynn Avenue. It's not supposed to be. This section of Pine, it's serving as a temporary significant transportation corridor, mainly during commuter hours and until the Champlain Parkway is built. And our neighborhood's been awaiting completion of that parkway so that we can reclaim our neighborhood street that's been dividing us from the neighborhood east of Pine and the neighborhood west of Pine. The parkway is going to take 40% of the traffic off of our street and turn us back to the neighborhood that we once were. And our vision would be that Pine would have traffic calming measures. We've talked to DPW and they're telling us wait till the parkway is built and put traffic calming measures. So like at Morrison Ferguson or 4-way stop at Lyman. And it's really the Champlain Parkway that is and will be the major multimodal transportation corridor. And you don't see it on this map, but that's what should be designated as a residential corridor, not our current residential low intensity neighborhood and street. So the change, I really feel our neighbors here are just sort of getting wind of this proposal and what's proposed, and we really feel like it's mischaracterizing our street and our neighborhood, and it's out of context, scale, and character. And, you know, I want to emphasize that I support what you're doing, and I think that there are things that we can do here in our neighborhood and street, but this proposal to take us all the way from the lowest intensity to the highest intensity south of Flynn goes too far, and it's going to be really detrimental to the neighborhood that we are. And so I wanted to provide you all that feedback. I'd be interested in any comments you have about it. And I think, like, you know, some questions we have are, when is this going to be set in stone? What do y'all need to see and hear from our neighborhood to reconsider this proposal?
Great, thanks for that. And I see there's actually a couple comments here in the Q&A that are very similar. So I appreciate you bringing that up and sharing that in the full context. So I think I appreciate your comment about the context sensitive solutions that we're taking great care to propose as part of the neighborhood code. And I think it is important to just come back to that the goal with the corridors, we do recognize that by designating some of these areas as corridors, it will represent a shift in what is on the ground. So I appreciate, and I apologize if I didn't say that as clearly as I had intended to. The corridors, though, as you noted, are not all exactly the same. And this area of Lower Pine Street that you're talking about, really south of Flynn Ave, is an area that we've heard some discussion about in our committee. And I think that we have not gotten to this specific location yet, but this is probably going to be the very next location that we talk about in the next committee meeting. And I would suspect that it might be an area that the committee recommends not be moved into a corridor. So I just want to acknowledge that. And then I think that the other piece that you had brought up is about kind of the zoning along the Champlain Parkway. And this relates to a question that we got in the Q&A that we responded to earlier, where we really have been looking at what is allowed along the parkway and how do we leverage that to allow for more intense and really mixed use development. That was one of the reasons why we looked at that new South End Innovation District overlay on a portion of the area between Lakeside and Sears Lane. So appreciate that comment and agree that that's a new and important thoroughfare and that it will make changes to the transportation and traffic characteristics of Lower Pine Street. So in terms of when this will be set in stone, the committee is really in the middle of their process of talking about these changes, and that's why we wanted to have this opportunity to share more about them with you. The next meeting that the committee is going to have is November 28th at 6:30 p.m. And that will be both an in-person and a virtual meeting. So encourage you to reach out to, if you want to submit comments in writing about anything that you heard tonight, you can feel free to send them to Sarah and I, and we'll make sure that the committee gets them, or you're welcome to come and join us at that committee meeting and share your comments personally. Let's see here. A couple questions have been coming in. I think we answered a few of those. Sarah, do we have someone else who wants to speak?
We have Dina, and I believe Dina had asked a couple of her, had raised her hand prior to Colin's Q&A question, so we'll get her to unmute.
Okay.
All right, Dina.
Oh, Dina,
Hi,
if you, oh, there we go. Great. Yes, we can hear you now.
Can you hear me? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear us?
I can't hear you now.
Okay. Dina, we can hear you. Are you able to hear us now?
Can you hear me now? I can't hear you, so I'm not sure what's going on. I guess I'll put my comments in the chat if you can hear me, because I'm not sure what's going on.
Okay. Great. So while Dina is putting her comment in the chat, I'll also just note that several folks have written into the Q&A to say that they agree with and support Gabe's comments. There was also a question that I think we can answer really quickly, which is, can we show where the Champlain Parkway would be on this map? Sarah, are you able to point that out? It's not drawn on here, but are you able to point that out?
I did just pull up the project map, so let me go
Oh,
ahead and
great.
share that.
Essentially though, while Sarah still has this map up, I think it seems like several people are interested in the corridor that's proposed for Southern Pine Street. So basically where you see the words Pine Street on this map, you might be able to tell that there's an area of this map that doesn't have any color on it, just behind those words. That's essentially the path of the parkway. Right, so thank you, Sarah, for pulling this up. So the green sort of line that has all of these colored icons on it, this is the path of the Champlain Parkway. And just a couple blocks over, you can see Lower Pine Street. A couple blocks over to the right, you can see Lower Pine Street. So hope that helps with the context. All right, so we had Colin, and then we'll go to somebody else who has their hand up. Has East Ave been considered for RM or high density? As a corridor directly next to the city's largest employers, this seems like an area where allowing higher density would make sense. Thanks for that question, Colin. This also is a question that has come up in the context of the Joint Committee's discussions. And I would say the main reason why it was not initially proposed by us as being a corridor, by us meaning staff as being a corridor, is because it was not explicitly called out as a major kind of mixed use corridor in our neighborhood plan. Also, one side of the street is in the low density residential district, and the west side of the street, closer to the hospital, is actually in the institutional zoning district. So again, this corridor is kind of one of those places where, as we mentioned before, we're not really looking at the zoning outside of the residential areas. But the question has come up, and I would imagine that the committee would talk about this a little bit and make a decision about whether or not to include it.
Awesome. I'm gonna go ahead and allow Amelia to take the floor. Amelia, you should be able to speak now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. I live a few houses down from Dina, so
Okay.
since she can't speak now, but I'm on Lower Pine Street as well, and I had heard a little bit about the zoning things with the like the Innovation District, and someone had briefly spoken to me at the farmers market, but I have to say I was really surprised when at Halloween my city council person was like, "Oh, hey, Amelia, did you know about Pine Street?" And I was like, "What?" So I think some of these bigger changes are going to be a real surprise to a lot of us. I tried to post it on Front Porch Forum, but even the way it was presented, sorry, Sarah, by you on Front Porch Forum didn't really get a lot of people's attention, I think. And at least for those of us on these two blocks, that would be a really big change. I think if there are more ways we can get the information out, dragging around the city's website can be kind of exhausting. But if there's, I would volunteer to go door to door, honestly. But I think there needs to be a little more education about what's involved. I think we're all in favor of, duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, those adorable cottage courts. But, if you kind of do the math on like what a person could put on my house lot, if they took my house off, you could put 12 good size units just on my house lot. And that would completely change the fabric of the neighborhood. And that's not even thinking about parcels that are currently owned by the Howard Center, which are bigger and could be lumped together. And I wonder, in the study, it said that this was being done to try and keep things from developers from bulldozing bunches of houses and consolidating lots. But it seems like that's exactly what would need to happen. There's 16 houses on my block of Pine Street. All it takes is for somebody to buy one and then wait it out and then buy the next one. And before you have it, there's no small houses for anyone to buy in the city either. Because we still want to have a mix of housing, and little houses on little lots are nice too. And then just to follow up on what Gabe was saying, so we've got a planning committee meeting coming up and we can all go, but what are other ways that we can kind of voice our concerns over the changes in the zoning?
Great, thank you, Amelia. And so I want to start also by acknowledging your point about the discussion about this. And I think I'm glad that there are a lot of you here tonight to share this concern. When we first started the conversation with the committee about all of these areas, we had not yet defined what the corridors might look like. When we've been out talking with folks all summer long, we had been, really explaining that we were looking at these different neighborhood scale housing types. And I think if you go up one more, Sarah, a lot of the sort of images and description of what we were talking about looks like what you see here. We were still deciding how to formulate the recommendation for the corridors as the committee work started. Early on in that committee process, there was a discussion. If you flip one ahead, Sarah, if you look at this image in the lower right-hand side, underneath the box that says proposed corridor standards, we were having a discussion about townhouses, and there was a lot of strong interest in townhouses in some locations, such as along corridors, as a really affordable and approachable form of housing that could be added in some locations. And a committee member observed, if we think that allowing townhouses could be an acceptable form of housing in these locations, why not buildings that are similar in size to a row of 3 or 4 townhouses, but might be able to be split into several apartments instead of just 3 or 4 homes? And some of the committee agreed with that, and that was kind of where we started developing the question and the discussion about what these recommendations could look like at the sort of maximum end for those corridors. So I just want to kind of share how we got there, because it's very much, this conversation is evolving right now based on the committee's work and based on the feedback they're hearing. So that was definitely not kind of a secret that we were holding out in those earlier conversations. That said, there has also been some pressure and some requests at the committee to allow these corridors to even go bigger. And we actually, at our meeting just a couple of weeks ago, discussed for quite some time that moving even further beyond what's illustrated here for those corridors would be inappropriate, and that that's not the scope of what the neighborhood code is talking about. So again, just sharing that context, and also appreciate and recognizing that you're sharing that even that scale would not be appropriate in some parts of the city that have been called out for corridors, like Lower Pine. So as far as other ways that you can share your feedback, the committee will be meeting throughout the rest of the fall. We do have a date at the end of November and another one, I think, in mid-December. We are working right now to figure out what some of the rest of the schedule will look like. And so we'll have more information about that full schedule soon. But again, if you want to write to us, if you want to talk to your city council, or if you know members of the Planning Commission, I know they'd be happy to hear from you as well about your feedback on these proposals. All right, we'll go to Dina. Put her comment in the Q&A, so I'll just read that out. I strongly second Gabe's comments. I'm in the last block of Pine. Our neighborhood has only one multi-unit building on the west side, and most houses have been purchased in recent years by young families with children. Most have been renovated with much work done. This block will be a dead end when the parkway is completed. It will not be a major transportation corridor once the parkway is open. It makes no sense to take a well-established all single-family neighborhood and essentially transform its character completely. And then Dina just followed up and asked, can we describe the process after the Planning Commission? Great question. So when the Joint Committee feels like they're done with their work on these recommendations, there will be a couple things that will happen. One is that they will actually hold a formal public hearing, either when they're done or when they feel like they're pretty far along in terms of their recommendations. They'll hold a formal public hearing, which will be another opportunity for folks to hear about how these ideas have evolved and share their feedback on them. They'll then make any sort of final changes that they would like to make based on that feedback. And ultimately, they refer this to the City Council for the City Council to hold a public hearing and to consider whether or not they want to adopt these changes. We're anticipating that the committee will continue to meet throughout the end of the year and probably early into the new year. And I think at this point, we're not anticipating that this would be in front of the City Council until kind of later in the winter in 2024.
Megan, I just want to add that in the chat, I've added a link to our website that also reviews some of the Joint Committee process, as well as presentation materials from the past 4 meetings, as well as materials throughout presentations over the last year.
All right. Are there other questions? I don't see any more in the chat. Nobody else has their hand up right now, but if anybody has any follow-up, we'd be happy to take them. All right. Well, just want to say thanks again. Oh, what is the meeting tomorrow like? The coffee hour in the morning is maybe what you're talking about, Amelia. So we will be meeting in Schmanska Park over in the Old East End. And that will just be a really informal time for you to come chat with Sarah and I about what the neighborhood code is about. Share your feedback, ask questions, hear from other people about their feedback and questions. It's really an open-ended structure based on whatever folks want to talk to us about the neighborhood code. So that'll be at 9 a.m. again at Schmanska Park if anybody would like to join. And then as we noted before, the next kind of formal committee meeting will be on November 28th at 6:30. We typically post the materials that the committee plans to review on the city's public meeting platform called Civic Clerk about a week in advance. So we recognize that that meeting is the week after Thanksgiving. So we're hoping to actually have that up by next Monday. We also always have an opportunity during those meetings for public comment, and anything that you write into us that you would like to be sent along to the committee, we forward as an email, and we also post online with the meeting materials. So really encourage you, if you've got some feedback that you want to share ahead of that meeting, pass it along and we'll make sure it gets to the committee. And thank you, Sarah, for sharing the link to our website in the chat. As we identify more dates and other opportunities to provide feedback on this, those will be added to that website, and we'll send out other communications as well.
If you aren't already signed up to receive more information on our newsletter list, we are sending out frequent updates following the committee meetings with where we are in the process, and as well as looking forward, which you can find and sign up for on our website as well.
All right, well, not seeing any other comments or hands, so just want to say thank you again for coming tonight and for sharing your feedback. This is really important, and helpful specific feedback about what the committee is talking about, specific to the corridors in particular. And hope to chat with or hear from you more in the future as they continue their work. So thank you all for joining and have a great night.